The summer sun was setting over the city as 15-year-old Marcus Thompson walked home from basketball practice. His navy blue school backpack hung heavy on his shoulders, filled with books and his sweaty practice uniform. The river path was his favorite route home, peaceful and quiet compared to the busy main streets. Marcus was a good kid. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that. He helped old Mrs. Jenkins with her groceries every Sunday and tutored younger kids at the community center on weekends. His mother had raised him right, teaching him to work hard and stay out of trouble. He was on the honor roll, and his basketball coach said he had a real shot at a college scholarship if he kept his grades up. The gentle sound of water lapping against the riverbank usually calmed him, but something felt different that evening. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up when he heard the slow crunch of tires on gravel behind him. Marcus didn't turn around. His mother's words echoed in his head. "Stay calm, be polite. Keep your hands where they can see them." "Hey you, stop right there," a harsh voice called out. Marcus stopped walking, his heart beating faster but his movements slow and deliberate. Two police officers stepped out of their patrol car, their hands already resting on their weapons. "Turn around, nice and slow," the taller officer commanded. His nameplate read Sullivan. The other officer, Rollins, circled behind Marcus like a shark. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied quietly, following their instructions perfectly. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Is something wrong?" Officer Sullivan stepped closer, his face tight with suspicion. "There was a robbery 3 blocks from here. Suspect matches your description. Young black male, athletic build, dark clothes." Marcus's throat felt dry. "Sir, I've been at basketball practice. You can call my coach. Coach Williams at Roosevelt High. I have my student ID right here in my front pocket." "Shut up," Rollins snapped, moving closer. "We're tired of your kind always having excuses." Marcus stood very still, his hands visible at his sides. "Please, officers, I'm just trying to get home. My mom's expecting me." "Your mom?" Sullivan laughed, a cruel sound that echoed off the water. "What about your dad? Let me guess. Not in the picture?" The words stung, but Marcus kept his voice steady. "My father is—" "Did I say you could speak?" Sullivan grabbed Marcus's backpack, ripping it off his shoulders. Books and papers scattered across the ground. Marcus's perfect math test, the one he'd been so proud to show his mom, landed in a puddle. "Look at this. Probably stolen stuff," Rollins said, kicking the backpack toward the river's edge. Marcus felt tears forming but blinked them back. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "Please," Marcus said softly. "Those are my school things." The officers exchanged a look that made Marcus's blood run cold. Sullivan grabbed his left arm while Rollins seized his right. Marcus didn't resist. He knew better, but his heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. "Maybe you need to cool off," Sullivan sneered. "Learn some respect for the law." They dragged him closer to the river's edge. Marcus could smell the murky water, see the small waves slapping against the concrete barrier. Fear gripped him as he realized what they were about to do. "No, please," he begged. "I can't swim well." Their laughter cut through the evening air like shattered glass. With a powerful heave, they swung Marcus over the barrier. For a moment, he was suspended in air, his school shoes pointing at the darkening sky. Then came the shocking cold of the water, the panic of going under, the desperate fight to surface. Marcus thrashed in the deep water, his clothes pulling him down. He could hear the officers laughing above, the sound growing fainter as they walked away. His lungs burned as he struggled to keep his head above water. The current was stronger than it looked from above, pulling him away from the wall he desperately needed to reach. As darkness crept into the edges of his vision, Marcus' last thought was of his father. What these officers didn't know, couldn't know, was that James Thompson wasn't just any absent dad. He was a federal judge, and he would make sure justice was served. But first, Marcus had to survive. Diana Thompson stared at the clock on her kitchen wall for the 100th time. 8:45 p.m. Marcus should have been home 2 hours ago. Her son was never late, not without calling. The untouched plate of dinner had gone cold, and her hands shook as she dialed his phone number again. Straight to voicemail. She had already called all of Marcus's friends, his basketball coach, and even the local pizza places he sometimes stopped at. Nobody had seen him since practice ended. Coach Williams confirmed Marcus had left the gym at 6:00 p.m., taking his usual route home along the river. The river. Something about that thought made Diana's stomach twist. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was bored, almost annoyed. "Ma'am, your son is 15. Teenagers often stay out late without calling." "Not my Marcus," Diana insisted, her voice growing stronger with anger. "He's an honor student. He has perfect attendance. He always calls if he's going to be even 5 minutes late." "File a missing persons report if he's not back in 24 hours, the dispatcher said before hanging up. Diana grabbed her car keys. She wouldn't wait that long. As she drove toward the river path, she called her neighbors, members of their church, anyone who might help search. Within an hour, 20 people gathered at the basketball court, holding flashlights and wearing determined expressions. "We'll find him, Diana," Mrs. Jenkins said, patting her arm. "That boy of yours is special. The whole neighborhood knows it." They split into groups, calling Marcus's name into the growing darkness. Diana led the group along the river path, her flashlight beam dancing across the water's surface. Something caught her eye, a splash of white against the dark ground near the river's edge. Her heart stopped. It was a piece of paper, water-damaged but still readable. A math test with a perfect score, Marcus's neat handwriting in the corner. Next to it lay his backpack, some of its contents spilled across the ground. "Over here!" Diana screamed, her voice echoing off the water. The search party rushed to her side as she fell to her knees, clutching the wet paper to her chest. Mrs. Jenkins was already on the phone with 911. This time, they had to listen. This was evidence. 2 patrol cars arrived 15 minutes later. Diana noticed how the officers barely looked at her as she showed them Marcus's backpack, how they seemed more annoyed than concerned. "Probably just some teenage drama," one officer said, not even bothering to take notes. "Kids dump their school stuff all the time when they're running away." "My son didn't run away." Diana's voice cracked with fury and fear. "Something happened to him here. You need to search the river." The officers exchanged a look she couldn't read. "Ma'am, it's dark now. If you want to file a report." "I'll do more than file a report," Diana said, pulling out her phone. Her hands were steady now, anger replacing fear. "I'm calling my husband. He's been trying to reach Marcus too, but his flight just landed." "Lady, this isn't a federal case," the second officer scoffed. "Your husband can file a complaint in the morning like everyone else." Diana stood straighter, her voice ice cold. "My husband is Federal Judge James Thompson. Perhaps you've heard of him?" The change in the officer's demeanor was instant. They straightened up, their faces paling in the flashlight beams. One of them immediately got on his radio, calling for backup and a water rescue team. Within 30 minutes, the riverbank was lit up like daylight. Police boats appeared on the water, and a helicopter circled overhead with a searchlight. The same department that had dismissed her concerns was now mounting a full-scale rescue operation. Diana watched it all with a mixture of relief and rage. It shouldn't take her husband's title to make them care about her son's life. As she stared at the searchlights reflecting off the dark water, she made a silent promise to Marcus. She would find him, and then she would find out exactly what happened on this river path. Her phone buzzed, a text from James. "Just landed. On my way. We'll find our boy." Diana clutched Marcus's wet math test to her heart, praying they wouldn't be too late. Officer Sarah Chen sat alone in the precinct's video review room, her coffee growing cold beside her. It was 3 a.m., and her shift had ended hours ago, but something about the Thompson case bothered her. The security cameras along the river path hadn't been checked, or at least, that's what her sergeant had claimed. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, accessing footage from the evening Marcus disappeared. The first 2 cameras showed nothing unusual, but the third camera's files were marked as corrupted. Sarah frowned. After 3 years in it before joining the force, she knew that conveniently corrupted files often held the biggest secrets. It took her 20 minutes to recover the video. When the footage began playing, her coffee cup slipped from her fingers, splashing across the floor. There was Marcus, walking home. There were Officers Sullivan and Rollins, stopping him, and there, in clear view, was what they did to him. Sarah's hands shook as she copied the files to a secure drive. Sullivan and Rollins were veterans, respected officers who had trained half the force. But the footage didn't lie. She watched them assault a teenager and throw him into the river, laughing as they walked away. Down in the hospital's intensive care unit, Marcus lay unconscious, surrounded by beeping machines. The river patrol had found him caught in some branches downstream, barely alive. The doctors said he was lucky. A few more minutes in the cold water, and they wouldn't have been able to save him. Diana sat beside her son's bed, holding his hand. The steady beep of his heart monitor was both a comfort and a torture. He was alive, but he hadn't woken up yet to tell them what happened. A soft knock at the door made her look up. A young Asian woman in a police uniform stood there, nervously glancing down the hallway. "Mrs. Thompson?" Officer Chen whispered. "I'm Sarah Chen. I need to show you something, but not here. Can we talk in private?" Diana looked at Marcus, reluctant to leave his side. "It's about what happened to your son," Sarah added quietly. "I found footage." In a small waiting room down the hall, Sarah played the video on her laptop. Diana's hands covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she watched the truth unfold on the screen. "They tried to hide this," Sarah explained. "The file was marked as corrupted. I recovered it, but I don't trust sending it through official channels. They might bury it again." Diana's tears turned to steel in her eyes. "Send it to my phone. Now." Within an hour, the video was uploaded to social media. By sunrise, it had gone viral. News vans surrounded the hospital. Protesters gathered outside the police station. Every major network played the footage, showing two laughing officers throwing a teenage honor student into a river and leaving him to die. Sullivan and Rollins were called into the chief's office early that morning. They swaggered in, confident in their immunity, only to find internal affairs waiting for them. Their badges and guns were confiscated pending investigation. But the truth had broken open more than just one case. Other officers began coming forward, describing years of similar incidents that had been covered up. Senior officers who had helped hide complaints suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Sarah Chen became a target at the precinct. Her locker was vandalized, her car tires slashed, but for every officer who threatened her, two more quietly thanked her for having the courage they had lacked. Back in the hospital room, Marcus finally opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was his mother's face, tear-stained but smiling. Next to her stood his father, still in his travel clothes, having flown in from his conference. "The whole world knows what they did," Diana told him softly. "You're safe now, and they're going to pay for what they did to you." Marcus's throat was too sore to speak, but he squeezed his mother's hand. Outside his window, he could hear the chants of protesters demanding justice. For the first time since those officers grabbed him, he felt something close to peace. The truth had emerged, and with it, like the rising sun outside his window, came the promise of change. Federal Judge James Thompson stood in his son's hospital room, his normally perfect posture bent with exhaustion. His court robes had been replaced by a wrinkled suit from 2 days of travel, but the power of his presence still filled the room. Every nurse who entered could feel it. This was not a man to be trifled with. Marcus was awake now, but speaking was still difficult. The doctors said the river water had damaged his throat, but it would heal. James watched his son's chest rise and fall, each breath a reminder of how close they had come to losing him. "Judge Thompson." A nervous young police officer stood in the doorway. "The police chief is here to see you." James straightened his tie, kissed his sleeping son's forehead, and nodded to Diana. "I'll handle this." In the hospital's private conference room, Police Chief Williams sat with two city attorneys. Their faces were grave as James entered. They had known each other for years, played golf together, attended the same charity events. Now, the air between them crackled with tension. "James," the chief began, "I want you to know we're taking this very seriously." "Taking what seriously, Robert?" James's voice was quiet but sharp. "The fact that your officers tried to murder my son, or the fact that they almost got away with it." The chief winced. "Those officers have been suspended without pay. We're conducting a full investigation. Like the investigation you conducted when Mrs. Martinez's boy was beaten last year." James interrupted. "Or when the Wilson twins were falsely arrested. I read those reports, Robert. I saw how they disappeared into your system." One of the city attorneys cleared his throat. "Judge Thompson, we're prepared to offer a very generous settlement." "Stop talking." James held up his hand. The attorney's mouth snapped shut. I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in justice. And not just for my son. He pulled out a folder he brought from his office. Inside were dozens of complaints filed against Officers Sullivan and Rollins over the past 5 years. Each one had been dismissed or buried. I've spent the last 24 hours making calls, James continued. The Department of Justice is sending investigators. The FBI's Civil Rights Division is opening a case, and I've asked for a federal audit of every complaint filed against your department in the last decade. The chief's face paled. James, please. Think about what this will do to the department's reputation. I am thinking about it, James replied. I'm thinking about how that reputation protected officers who threw a child into a river. I'm thinking about all the other children who didn't have a federal judge for a father. He stood up, straightening to his full height. I'm recusing myself from any cases involving your department. Not because I have to, but because what I'm about to do will be completely separate from my position on the bench. I'm going to be a father seeking justice, and I'm going to use every legal tool at my disposal. The chief tried one last time. These things take time. They've taken too much time already. James cut him off. My son almost died, Robert. He was thrown into that river like his life meant nothing. And if Officer Chen hadn't found that footage, you would have let them get away with it. He walked to the door, then turned back. You have until tomorrow morning to suspend every officer who helped cover this up. After that, I start filing motions. And Robert? He paused. I never lose in court. The walk back to Marcus's room helped calm his anger. Outside, he could hear protesters chanting his son's name. Signs demanded justice, reform, accountability. The hospital had become the center of a movement. Diana looked up as he entered. How did it go? James loosened his tie and sat beside his son's bed. It started, but this isn't just about Marcus anymore. This is about every child they hurt before him, and every child we're going to protect after him. Marcus stirred in his sleep, and James took his hand. In that moment, he wasn't a federal judge. He was simply a father, watching his son breathe, and promising to make the world safer for him. Officer Sarah Chen walked into the Internal Affairs office, her back straight despite her exhaustion. For the third time this week, she was being questioned about the video she had found. But this time was different. FBI agents sat alongside the department investigators. Walk us through it again, Agent Torrey said kindly, pushing a cup of coffee toward her. Every detail matters. Sarah took a deep breath. I knew something wasn't right. The river path has 8 security cameras, but the report only mentioned checking 6. When I looked into the missing footage, I found it had been marked as corrupted just hours after Marcus Thompson was found. In another room down the hall, Officer Sullivan sat sweating under harsh lights. His usual confidence had cracked. His partner, Rollins, had already broken down during questioning the day before, admitting this wasn't their first time using excessive force. We were just teaching him respect, Sullivan insisted, his voice shaking. We didn't mean for him to almost die. The FBI agent across from him played the video again. The sound of Sullivan's own laughter as Marcus hit the water filled the room. You found it funny then, the agent observed. Is it still funny now? Outside the police station, reporters crowded around other officers coming forward with stories. Young officers spoke about being told to stay quiet when they witnessed abuse. Veterans admitted to hiding complaints from citizens who didn't matter enough to cause trouble. Sarah's locker had been vandalized again that morning. The word SNITCH was painted across it in ugly red letters. But next to the vandalism, someone had taped a note. Thank you for being brave. You're changing things. In the hospital, Marcus was getting stronger. He could speak now, though his voice was still rough. He had given his statement to the FBI, describing every detail of that evening. His father had sat beside him, recording every word, his judge's notebook filling with precise details that would help build the case. Back at the station, Sarah sat in the break room, trying to eat lunch. 2 older officers walked in, saw her, and turned to leave. Wait. Sarah called out. Sit down. We need to talk about this. Officer Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran, paused. About what? About how you're destroying careers? About how those careers were built on hurting people, Sarah replied firmly. About how many times we looked the other way because it was easier. Rodriguez's partner, Officer Martinez surprised them both by sitting down. "My nephew," he said quietly. "He's Marcus's age. Plays basketball too." When I saw that video, he shook his head. "We can't keep doing this." The internal investigation was spreading like a wildfire through the department. 6 more officers were suspended for helping cover up past incidents. The police chief had announced his early retirement, though everyone knew he was being forced out. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Diana Thompson. "Marcus wants to see you." At the hospital, Marcus was sitting up in bed, looking more like himself. Judge Thompson and Diana stood as Sarah entered. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said, his voice still raspy but clear. "You didn't know me. You could have ignored that video like everyone else." Sarah thought about her own little brother, about all the times she worried about him walking home alone. "No, I couldn't have." Judge Thompson stepped forward. "Officer Chen, I'm heading a commission to reform police training and oversight. We need voices like yours. People who understand both sides but choose to do what's right." Sarah looked at Marcus, at his parents. At the protest, she could still hear outside. Change was coming to the department, and she was part of it. "When do we start?" she asked. Outside, Sullivan and Rollins were being led to police cars in handcuffs. Their arrests were being broadcast live on every local channel. The blue wall of silence was crumbling, and through the cracks, justice was finally flowing like the river they had tried to use as a weapon. The courthouse steps were packed with people when Marcus Thompson arrived for the first day of the trial. 3 weeks had passed since he left the hospital, and his voice was finally back to normal. Walking up those steps was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but he wasn't alone. His mother Diana held his right hand, while his father walked on his left. Behind them came dozens of other families, all victims of police brutality who had never gotten their day in court, until now. Inside the courtroom, Officers Sullivan and Rollins sat in press suits, trying to look respectable. Their lawyer had told them to appear sorry, but their eyes still held the same cold look Marcus remembered from that night at the river. The prosecutor, Ms. Carter, stood before the jury. "This case is about more than 2 officers who threw a child into a river," she began. "It's about a system that made them think they could get away with it." From the gallery, Marcus watched as the evidence unfolded. The security camera footage played on a large screen, showing every terrible moment. Some jurors had to look away when they heard the officer's laughter. But there was more. Officer Chen testified about finding the hidden video. Other officers came forward to describe similar incidents that have been covered up. Former victims took the stand, telling stories that had been buried for years. During a break, Marcus sat in a quiet room with his father. "Dad," he asked, "what happens if they don't find them guilty?" Judge Thompson looked at his son carefully. "That's why we're not just trying 2 officers, son. We're pushing for complete reform. New training, new oversight, new leadership. Even if these 2 men somehow escape justice, the system that protected them is already changing." The defense tried to paint Sullivan and Rollins as good officers who made one mistake, but their own records told a different story. 27 complaints in 5 years, all mysteriously disappeared. Until now. Marcus's testimony came on the 4th day. He walked to the witness stand with steady steps, even though his heart was racing. The defense lawyer tried to confuse him, to make him doubt his own memories. "Isn't it true you were disrespectful to the officers?" the lawyer asked. Marcus sat straighter. "No, sir. I was taught to be respectful to everyone, but respect doesn't mean letting someone hurt you." In the gallery, Diana squeezed her husband's hand. Their son's voice was strong and clear. During lunch break, Marcus found a quiet corner in the courthouse. A young boy approached him, the son of another victim. "My dad never got justice," the boy said quietly. "But he's here every day watching you. He says you're fighting for all of us." The trial lasted 2 weeks. News cameras broadcast every moment. In police academies across the country, instructors used the case to teach what not to do. Police chiefs in other cities started reviewing their own complaint systems, worried they might be next. On the day of closing arguments, Ms. Carter stood before the jury one last time. "Marcus Thompson survived that river," she said. "But this trial isn't just about his survival. It's about making sure no other child ever faces those same dark waters." The defense tried one last time to paint it as a simple mistake. But the evidence was too strong, the story too clear. The jury took only 4 hours to reach their verdict. When the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, Marcus didn't cheer. He simply closed his eyes and remembered the river. Its dark waters had almost taken his life, but instead, they had started a wave of change that couldn't be stopped. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked how he felt. Marcus looked at Officer Chen, who had risked her career for truth. He looked at the other families who had found their voice through his case. He looked at his parents, who had turned their pain into purpose. Justice isn't just about punishment, he said. It's about making sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else. The autumn wind carried his words across the city, where they would echo in the halls of power for years to come. The sentencing hearing fell on a cold morning in December. Snow dusted the courthouse steps where, months earlier, Marcus had first walked in seeking justice. Now he returned to see that justice delivered. Officers Sullivan and Rollins sat in prison orange jumpsuits, a far cry from their once proud uniforms. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Martinez, looked down at them from her bench. The courtroom was packed with families, reporters, and police officers, some there to support their former colleagues, others to witness change. Before I announced the sentence, Judge Martinez said, "I want to hear from the victim." Marcus walked to the podium. He had grown taller in the months since the incident, his shoulders straighter, his voice stronger. The river had tried to break him, but instead had made him unbreakable. "I don't hate these officers," Marcus began, surprising everyone. "Hate is what made them throw me in that river. Hate is what made them think my life didn't matter. What I want is for them to understand what they did, and for the system to change so it never happens again." Sullivan stared at his hands. Rollins wiped tears from his eyes. Their lawyers had asked for leniency, claiming they were products of a broken system, but Judge Martinez wasn't moved. "The system may be flawed," she declared, "but each officer makes a choice. You chose to abuse your power. You chose to harm a child. You chose to laugh while doing it. Those choices have consequences." She sentenced them to 15 years each. As they were led away, their families cried. Marcus watched them go, feeling not joy but a quiet sense of completion. Outside the courtroom, more changes were spreading through the department. The new police chief, an African-American woman named Lisa Brooks, had been appointed with a mandate for reform. Her first act was to create a civilian oversight board, with Officer Sarah Chen as the police liaison. "We're reviewing every complaint from the past decade," Chief Brooks announced to the press. "Every victim will be heard. Every officer involved will be held accountable." The old guard was crumbling. 5 more officers faced charges for past abuses. Others retired early, seeing the writing on the wall. But new recruits were coming in, young, diverse, committed to doing things differently. At the police academy, training changed dramatically. New courses on racial bias and de-escalation became mandatory. Every cadet watched the video of Marcus in the river, learning how quickly power could corrupt and how important their choices would be. Diana Thompson started a support group for families affected by police misconduct. They met in the community center where Marcus used to tutor kids. Some nights, the room was filled with tears as people finally told stories they kept hidden for years. Other nights, there was laughter and hope as they planned for a better future. Judge Thompson kept his promise to stay away from cases involving the police department. Instead, he worked with civil rights lawyers to create new guidelines for police oversight. His experience as both a judge and a victim's father gave him a unique perspective that shaped policies across the state. One evening, Marcus visited the river for the first time since that night. Officer Chen went with him, both of them standing quietly by the railing. "Sometimes I still hear their laughter," Marcus admitted. "But then I remember everything that's changed because of what happened here." Sarah nodded. "The department will never be the same. Yesterday, a rookie stopped his partner from using excessive force. He said your story taught him to speak up." The river flowed peacefully below them, its dark waters catching the sunset. Marcus thought about Sullivan and Rollins in their prison cells, about the families finding their voices, about the new officers learning to serve with compassion instead of fear. Justice isn't just about punishment, he repeated his words from the trial. It's about making sure the world changes for the better. Sarah smiled. And it has, one ripple at a time. They watched the water flow, carrying away the last shadows of that terrible night, bringing instead the promise of a new day where power meant protection, not abuse, and where every life mattered equally under the law. 1 year had passed since that fateful night by the river. The city had changed in ways no one could have predicted. On a bright spring morning, Marcus Thompson stood at a podium outside the newly renamed Community Justice Center, addressing a crowd of students, officers, and citizens. "A year ago, I was just a kid who liked basketball and math," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the quiet crowd. "Now I'm standing here as the leader of Youth Voices for Change, speaking to future police officers about what justice really means." The audience included 30 new police cadets, part of the reform training program that Marcus helped design. Among them sat Officer Sarah Chen, now promoted to lieutenant and head of the department's new Community Relations Division. Behind Marcus, his parents beamed with pride. Judge Thompson had stepped down from the federal bench to run the Justice Center full-time, working to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Diana led support groups for families affected by police misconduct, turning pain into purpose. "Last week, something amazing happened," Marcus continued. "A young officer stopped his partner from using excessive force. When asked why, he said he remembered my story. That officer saved 2 lives that day, the citizen he protected, and his partner who might have made a terrible mistake." The changes weren't just happening in their city. Police departments across the country had adopted their training programs. The Thompson Standards, as they were now called, became a model for police reform nationwide. Sullivan and Rollins's case was now taught in law schools, a reminder of how power could corrupt and how justice could transform. Their prison sentences had inspired other officers to come forward about misconduct, breaking the blue wall of silence. After the speech, Marcus walked with Sarah to the river path where everything had started. The old security cameras had been replaced with better ones, monitored by a civilian oversight committee. New lights lined the path and emergency call boxes stood ready every 100 feet. "Remember when we stood here last year?" Sarah asked, looking at the water. "You said justice wasn't just about punishment." "You were right." Marcus nodded, watching a group of kids playing basketball at the new Riverside court. One of them was his younger cousin, who no longer had to fear walking home alone. "The river taught me something," Marcus said. "Water can destroy, but it can also wash things clean. What happened here destroyed the old system, but it helped build something better." That evening, the Thompson family hosted a community dinner at the Justice Center. Former victims sat with reformed officers, sharing stories and ideas for further improvements. The new police chief made regular appearances at these dinners, building trust one conversation at a time. Diana watched her son moving through the crowd, greeting everyone by name. The scared boy in the hospital bed had grown into a strong young man who turned his trauma into change. She caught Sarah's eye across the room, sharing a smile with the woman who had risked everything to expose the truth. Judge Thompson stood to make an announcement. Today, the City Council approved funding for 10 new youth centers. Each one will have police officers working alongside community leaders, building relationships instead of barriers. The room erupted in applause. Marcus hugged his father, remembering how close they had come to losing everything. Now they were building something that would last for generations. As the sun set, Marcus walked to the window. The river glittered in the distance, its waters now a symbol of transformation instead of terror. On its banks, children played without fear, watched over by officers who had learned to serve and protect all citizens equally. "This is just the beginning," Marcus whispered to himself, touching the glass. The ripples from that terrible night had become waves of change, washing away decades of distrust and building bridges where walls once stood. Outside, the city lights reflected on the river's surface, dancing like stars on the water. The same river that had almost taken his life had given birth to a movement that would save countless others. In its flow, Marcus saw the future, a future where justice rolled down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.